I thought my days of romance were buried with my husband of 45 years. At 68, everyone around me seemed convinced that love was a young person's game, and I was foolish to even dream of finding companionship again. What they didn't know was that I had just met someone who would turn their narrow-minded assumptions upside down, and when they discovered he was 30 years younger than me, their shock would be nothing compared to what else I had in store for them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though most people call me Maggie, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I'd be sharing this story about second chances and the courage it takes to defy everyone's expectations. But here I am, ready to tell you about the day my own family decided my heart was too old to love again. It started on a humid Thursday morning in June, when I was tending to the rose garden William and I had planted together 30 years ago. The morning dew still clung to the petals, and I was lost in memories of how he used to surprise me with fresh-cut blooms every Friday. That's when I heard the familiar crunch of gravel in my driveway, followed by the slam of car doors that seemed heavier than usual. My brother-in-law Richard's silver sedan was parked behind my daughter Carol's white SUV, and I could see my son Stephen's blue pickup truck pulling in behind them. My heart lifted momentarily at the sight of family gathering, though something about their synchronized arrival felt orchestrated rather than spontaneous. Richard was the first to approach, his weathered face set in the serious expression he'd worn ever since William's funeral 2 years ago. At 72, he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd always been the decision-maker in the Thompson family, a role he'd claimed even more firmly since his older brother's passing. "Maggie," he called out, his voice carrying that tone I'd learned to recognize as trouble brewing. "We need to have a word with you." I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves and forced a smile. Carol emerged from her vehicle looking polished, as always in her real estate blazer, her expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses. Stephen followed more slowly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, clearly uncomfortable with whatever mission had brought them all here together. "Well, this is a lovely surprise," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Come in, I'll put on some coffee." We settled in my living room, the same space where William and I had hosted countless family gatherings, birthday celebrations, and holiday meals. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains I'd sewn, myself, illuminating the family photographs that still covered the mantelpiece. William's presence seemed to linger in every corner of the room, from his favorite armchair that no one ever sat in anymore to the bookshelf filled with his collection of Civil War histories. Richard positioned himself in the center of the sofa, like he was chairing a board meeting, while Carol perched on the edge of her seat, checking her phone with the efficiency of someone always managing multiple crises. Stephen chose the chair furthest from me, his discomfort evident in the way he avoided eye contact. "Maggie," Richard began, clearing his throat with the gravity of someone about to deliver important news. "We've been talking, and we're concerned about some decisions you've been making lately." My stomach tightened, though I kept my expression neutral. "What decisions would those be?" Carol finally looked up from her phone, sliding her sunglasses up to rest on her head. "Mom, Helen Martinez has been talking around town. She mentioned, you've been spending time with someone new." The way she said, "someone new," made it sound like I'd been caught in some sort of criminal activity. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, part embarrassment and part indignation. Helen had been my closest friend for over 20 years, and while she meant well, her tendency to share news had clearly reached my family before I was ready to discuss it myself. "I have many friends, Carol. I'm not sure what specifically has you concerned." Stephen shifted in his chair, finally meeting my eyes. "Mom, she said you've been seen around town with a younger man. A lot younger." The emphasis on younger hung in the air like an accusation. I could feel the weight of their collective judgment settling over the room like a thick blanket. suffocating the easy warmth that had once defined our family gatherings. Richard leaned forward, his expression a mixture of concern and disapproval. "Maggie, we know you've been lonely since William passed. That's perfectly natural. But we're worried you might be making some poor choices in your grief." "Poor choices?" I repeated, hearing my voice take on an edge I rarely used with family. "Look," Carol said, her professional tone kicking in as if she were explaining market conditions to a confused client. "We understand the desire for companionship, but you need to be realistic about your situation. You're 68 years old, Mom. Dating. At your age comes with complications, and if this person is significantly younger, well, that raises red flags about their motivations." The word motivations stung more than I'd expected. The implication was clear. What could a younger person possibly want with me except for what I might provide them financially or materially? Stephen nodded in agreement with his sister. "We're just trying to protect you, Mom. There are people out there who target widows, especially ones in your position." "My position?" I asked quietly. Richard gestured around the room, taking in the well-maintained Victorian house, the quality furniture, the subtle signs of financial security that William's successful accounting practice had provided. "You're a woman of means, Maggie. This house alone is worth a considerable amount, not to mention William's life insurance and retirement accounts. You're vulnerable to people who might see you as an easy target." The conversation continued for another hour, each of them taking turns explaining why my budding relationship was problematic, inappropriate, or downright dangerous. They spoke about me as if I weren't sitting right there, discussing my judgment, my emotional state, and my future, like I was a child who couldn't be trusted to make decisions for herself. Carol pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be research she'd conducted. "I looked into this, Mom. There are entire websites dedicated to warning older women about younger men who prey on their loneliness and financial security. The statistics are alarming." "And what about love?" I asked quietly. "What about the possibility that two people might genuinely care for each other regardless of age?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's expression softened, slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Maggie, we loved William like a brother. He was a good man who took care of you for 45 years. But that chapter of your life is over. It's time to focus on aging gracefully and enjoying your golden years, without complicating things with romantic entanglements that are likely to end in heartbreak or financial disaster." Stephen nodded solemnly. "We just want what's best for you, Mom. And honestly, what would people think? You dating someone young enough to be your son? It doesn't look good for the family reputation." There it was. The real concern wasn't my happiness or even my financial security. It was their discomfort with how my choices might reflect on them. I felt something inside me shift, a tectonic plate of patience and accommodation that had been supporting our family dynamics for decades. "So you've all decided this for me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Without meeting Daniel, without understanding our relationship, without considering my feelings, you've determined that I'm too old for love." Carol's face flushed. "That's not what we're saying, Mom. We're saying you need to be practical. You need to think about the future, about maintaining the dignity and security that Dad worked so hard to provide for you." Richard stood up, clearly feeling the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "We're asking you to end this relationship, Maggie, for your own good and for the family's peace of mind." The request hung in the air like an ultimatum wrapped in concern. I looked at each of them, these people I had loved and supported and sacrificed for throughout their entire lives. Carol, whom I had encouraged through her divorce, helping her rebuild her confidence and career. Stephen, whose business I had helped fund when banks wouldn't give him a loan. Richard, whom I had supported through his wife's long illness, cooking meals and providing comfort when he couldn't cope. "And if I refuse?" I asked. The discomfort in the room was palpable. Carol exchanged a look with Richard before answering. Then we'll have to consider other options to protect you from yourself. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. They would find ways to interfere, to make my life difficult, to perhaps even question my mental competency if I didn't comply with their wishes. I had seen it happen to other elderly people in town whose families decided they were no longer capable of making their own decisions. I see, I said, standing slowly. Well, thank you all for your concern. I'll certainly give your advice the consideration it deserves. They seemed satisfied with this response, interpreting my words as capitulation rather than the careful non-commitment they actually represented. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, each of them hugged me with the relieved affection of people who believed they had successfully managed a difficult situation. After they left, I sat alone in my living room as the afternoon shadows grew longer, feeling the weight of their ultimatum settling over me like a heavy cloak. They had assumed I would simply comply, that their collective disapproval would be enough to make me abandon the first real happiness I'd felt since William's death. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't just about Daniel. Though my feelings for him had surprised me with their intensity and authenticity, this was about my right to make my own choices, to define my own future, to refuse to be relegated to the narrow box they had constructed for acceptable behavior for a woman of my age. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden where I'd been working when they arrived. The roses William and I had planted were in full bloom, more beautiful and vibrant than they had been in years. Like me, they had been given proper care and attention, and they were responding by flourishing rather than simply surviving. That evening, I called Helen Martinez, knowing she would be anxious to hear about the family confrontation she had inadvertently triggered. "Oh, Maggie," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I never meant for this to happen. I was just so excited for you, seeing you happy again. I may have mentioned to Carol when I ran into her at the grocery store that you seem to be glowing lately. It's all right, Helen. They would have found out eventually. What are you going to do? I was quiet for a long moment, considering not just her question, but the broader implications of my answer. I'm going to make a choice, Helen. Maybe the most important choice I've made in years. And Daniel? How does he feel about all this family drama? That was the question that had been weighing on me since my family left. Daniel Rodriguez was 38 years old, successful in his own right as a landscape architect and fitness instructor, and completely unaware of the storm his presence in my life had created. We had met 3 months ago at the Riverside Community Center, where I volunteered with the Historical Society's archive project, and he was consulting on their garden restoration. Our relationship had developed slowly and naturally, built on long conversations about books, shared appreciation for classical music, and a surprising intellectual compatibility that transcended our age difference. He was kind, thoughtful, and treated me with a respect and genuine interest that I hadn't experienced in years. But I hadn't told him about William's life insurance policy, or the investment accounts, or the fact that our modest Victorian house sat on prime real estate that had tripled in value over the past decade. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but because those things had never seemed relevant to what we were building together. Now, faced with my family's accusations and ultimatums, I realized I needed to be completely honest with Daniel about the situation we were both walking into. He deserved to know what he was up against, and I needed to know if he was prepared to stand with me against the judgment and interference we would inevitably face. The next morning, I called Daniel and asked if he could come over for dinner. There was something important we needed to discuss, I told him, and it couldn't wait any longer. As I prepared his favorite meal of grilled salmon with herbs from my garden, I thought about the choice I was facing. I could end things with Daniel, return to the safe, lonely existence my family expected of me, and spend my remaining years as the dignified widow they wanted me to be. Or I could fight for my right to love and be loved, regardless of what others thought appropriate for a woman of my age. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. I was 68 years old, not dead. I had decades of life left to live, and I refused to spend them in the emotional exile my family had prescribed for me. But I also knew that if I was going to fight this battle, I needed to fight it strategically. My family had underestimated me, assuming I would fold under pressure as I had so many times before when faced with their collective disapproval. They saw me as a vulnerable widow who needed their protection and guidance. What they didn't see was the woman who had helped build William's accounting practice from nothing, who had managed our investments and financial planning for the past 15 years, who had network and resources they had never bothered to learn about. They saw the surface of my life, but had missed the depth of my capabilities and connections. As I set the table for dinner, I realized this wasn't just about defending my relationship with Daniel. This was about reclaiming my agency, my right to self-determination, and my refusal to be diminished by other people's narrow definitions of what was appropriate for my age and stage of life. The evening would bring honest conversations with Daniel about what we were facing together. The days ahead would bring strategic planning and careful preparation for the battle I knew was coming. But tonight, as I waited for the man I was falling in love with to arrive for dinner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt powerful. And that power, I realized, was about to change everything. Daniel arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the soft smile that had first caught my attention at the community center. At 38, he moved with the confident grace of someone comfortable in his own skin, his dark hair showing just the first hints of silver at the temples. He was dressed casually in khakis and a blue button-down that brought out his eyes, and as always, he greeted me with a warmth that made me feel genuinely valued. "Something smells incredible," he said, kissing my cheek in the easy, affectionate way that had become natural between us. "Did you make that herb butter sauce again?" "I did," I replied, feeling some of my tension ease just from his presence. "But Daniel, we need to talk tonight. About us, about my family, about things I should have told you weeks ago." His expression grew more serious, but not worried. One of the things I appreciated most about Daniel was his emotional maturity. He didn't panic at the prospect of difficult conversations or assume the worst when I said we needed to discuss something important. "Of course," he said simply. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Over dinner, I told him everything. About my family's visit, their ultimatum, their assumptions about his motivations, and my vulnerability. I watched his face carefully as I explained their concerns about the age difference, their warnings about younger men who prey on lonely widows, their demand that I end our relationship for my own protection. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something approaching anger, though I could tell he was working to keep his emotions in check. "So, they think I'm some kind of gold digger," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "They think I'm using you for money." "I'm afraid so. And Daniel, there's something else you need to know. Something I should have been more upfront about from the beginning." I had prepared for this conversation by gathering documents from William's desk, bank statements, and investment portfolios that painted a clear picture of my financial situation. I spread them across the dining room table like evidence in a case, watching Daniel's eyes widen as he took in the numbers. "Maggie," he said softly, looking up from the papers, "you're wealthy. I mean, seriously wealthy." William was very successful, and he was excellent with investments. The house is paid off. There's substantial savings, a stock portfolio, life insurance proceeds. My family isn't wrong about me being financially comfortable. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "No wonder they're concerned. From their perspective, it must look like I'm after your money. Are you? I asked directly, needing to hear his answer even though I already knew it in my heart. He reached across the table and took my hands, his touch warm and steady. Maggie, I fell in love with a woman who laughs at terrible puns and knows more about local history than anyone I've ever met. I fell in love with someone who challenges me intellectually and makes me want to be a better person. I had no idea about any of this financial stuff, and honestly, it doesn't change how I feel about you. But it changes our situation significantly. They're going to fight this, Daniel. They're going to make our lives difficult, and they might try to turn other people against us. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. What do you want to do? The question was simple, but it carried enormous weight. He wasn't telling me what I should do or trying to minimize the problem. He was asking what I wanted, treating me as an equal partner in whatever decision we made. I want to fight, I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. I want to prove them wrong, not just about you, but about me. They see me as a helpless widow who can't be trusted to make her own decisions. They want to manage my life like I'm a child. Then we fight, Daniel said without hesitation. But we do it smart. What do you know about their vulnerabilities? What leverage do we have? The question revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated about Daniel before. He wasn't just offering emotional support. He was thinking strategically about how to protect what we had built together. His business background and practical nature were exactly what I needed in this situation. More than they realize, I said, feeling a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. They've made assumptions about what I know and what I'm capable of. But I've been managing family finances and relationships for decades. I know things they don't think I pay attention to. Over the next 2 hours, we laid out what I knew about each family member's vulnerabilities and dependencies. Carol's real estate business was struggling more than she let on, and she had borrowed money from me twice in the past year to cover office expenses. Stephen's auto repair shop was heavily leveraged, and he was behind on several loan payments. Richard, despite his authoritative demeanor, was facing his own financial pressures after his wife's medical bills had depleted their savings. They all depend on you more than they want to admit, Daniel observed. Financially and emotionally. Exactly. And they've all conveniently forgotten that I'm not just William's widow. I'm a person with my own relationships, my own network, my own resources. They think I've been sitting here for 2 years just waiting for them to make decisions about my life. Daniel grinned, and I could see admiration in his eyes. What aren't they expecting? They're not expecting me to have support from people they don't even know about. Dr. Patricia Moore at the Family Counseling Center has been helping me process my grief and plan for my future. Pastor James Wilson has been a source of guidance and strength. The Historical Society Board includes some of the most influential people in Cedar Falls, and they respect my contributions. And they're not expecting you to have someone like me in your corner, Daniel added. No, they're definitely not expecting that. They think you're either going to run when faced with family drama or that you'll reveal your true mercenary motives under pressure. Daniel laughed, a rich sound that filled the dining room. Well, they're going to be disappointed on both counts. As we cleaned up from dinner, Daniel asked the question I had been hoping he would. What's our first move? We're going to give them exactly what they're asking for, I said, enjoying the confused expression that crossed his face. We are? We're going to appear to comply with their demands while gathering information and building our own support network. They want me to be the dignified widow who makes appropriate choices for a woman of my age. So that's exactly what I'll be, at least on the surface. Daniel caught on quickly. And meanwhile, we continue our relationship more discreetly while I work behind the scenes to demonstrate that their assumptions about both of us are completely wrong. The plan we developed that evening was elegant in its simplicity. I would meet with each family member individually over the next week, appearing to take their concerns seriously while gathering more information about their own situations and motivations. Daniel would use his professional network to research Carol's real estate struggles and Stephen's business problems, information that might prove useful later. Most importantly, we would begin building a coalition of support among people whose opinions carried weight in our community. The Historical Society Board met monthly, and several members had already commented positively on the changes they'd seen in me over the past few months. Pastor Wilson had been encouraging me to embrace new opportunities for growth and connection. Dr. Moore had been working with me on rebuilding confidence and self-advocacy. "They think I'm isolated and vulnerable," I explained to Daniel as we sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge. "They don't realize I've been building a life and relationships that have nothing to do with them." "How long do you think this will take?" Daniel asked. "Not long. They're impatient people who are used to getting their way quickly. When they think I'm complying with their demands, they'll relax their guard. That's when we'll have the most leverage." The next morning, I called Carol and asked if she could meet me for lunch at the corner cafe downtown. I chose the location deliberately. It was public enough that our conversation would be observed by other community members, but intimate enough for a serious discussion. Carol arrived looking pleased with herself, clearly interpreting my lunch invitation as a sign that her intervention had been successful. She was dressed in her most professional outfit, ready to play the role of the responsible daughter helping her mother make wise decisions. "Mom, I'm so glad you called," she said, settling into her seat with satisfaction. "I know yesterday was difficult, but I really think we got through to you." "You certainly gave me a lot to think about," I replied diplomatically. "I wanted to ask you some questions about your concerns, to make sure I understand them fully." For the next hour, I listened as Carol expanded on her worries about my relationship with Daniel. She spoke about reputation, about the risk of financial exploitation, about the importance of maintaining the dignity that my age and position in the community required. But as she talked, I noticed something interesting. Many of her arguments seemed to stem from her own insecurities rather than genuine concern for my welfare. "Carol," I said gently when she paused for breath, "you mentioned being worried about what people would think. What people specifically?" She looked uncomfortable, for the first time since sitting down. "You know, people around town, clients, the church community. Have any of these people actually expressed concerns to you, or are you anticipating their reactions?" "Well, no, but I can imagine what they're thinking. It reflects on all of us, Mom. When the Thompson family matriarch is dating someone, young enough to be her son, it raises questions about judgment and propriety." There it was. Carol's real concern wasn't my happiness or security. It was how my choices affected her professional image. As a real estate agent in a small town, she depended on maintaining a certain reputation for stability and respectability. My relationship with Daniel threatened that carefully constructed image. "I see," I said thoughtfully. "And how has business been lately? I know the market has been challenging." Carol's face flushed slightly. "It's been tough, but I'm managing. Real estate always has its ups and downs." "Of course. I was just thinking, if you needed any help with cash flow or marketing expenses, you know you can always come to me. Family supports family." The reminder of my financial resources and her dependence on them was subtle, but effective. Carol's expression shifted slightly, and I could see her calculating the implications of pushing too hard against my wishes. My lunch with Stephen 2 days later followed a similar pattern. He was more direct than Carol, expressing concerns about my emotional vulnerability and the potential for heartbreak. But underneath his brotherly protectiveness, I detected the same self-interest that had motivated his sister. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Mom," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've been through so much with Dad's death. You deserve peace and stability, not drama and complications. And you think any relationship at my age automatically brings drama and complications? Stephen shifted uncomfortably. Not any relationship, but this one seems risky. The age difference alone is going to cause talk, and if it doesn't work out, you'll be left dealing with gossip and judgment. Stephen, can I ask you something personal? He nodded, though wariness crept into his expression. How are things? At the shop? I know you've been working hard to expand, but expansion is expensive. We're doing okay, he said carefully. Some months are better than others. I was thinking if you needed help with equipment financing or bridging loans, I'd be happy to discuss it. I believe in what you're building. Like Carol, Stephen immediately understood the subtext. Their opposition to my relationship could have financial consequences for them, while their support might bring benefits. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it was a reminder of the complex web of interdependence that connected our family. My conversation with Richard was the most challenging because he was the most perceptive of the three. He had been William's business partner for years before my husband started his own practice, and he understood money, motivation, and family dynamics better than his niece and nephew. We met at his house, the same modest ranch where he had lived with his wife Eleanor before her death 3 years ago. The place still felt empty without her warm presence, and I could see that Richard's opposition to my relationship stemmed partly from his own grief and loneliness. Maggie, he said as we sat in his living room with coffee and homemade cookies, I know you think we're being harsh about this Daniel fellow, but I've seen what happens when older people get involved with younger partners. It rarely ends well. Have you actually seen this, Richard? Or are you repeating things you've heard? He paused, considering his answer. I've heard stories. Read articles. It's a common pattern. But you haven't met Daniel. You don't know anything about him. Except his age. That's true, Richard admitted. But Maggie, the age difference is significant. What could a 38-year-old man possibly have in common with a 68-year-old woman? The question stung because it revealed the fundamental assumption underlying all their objections. They couldn't imagine that someone younger might find me intellectually stimulating, emotionally attractive, or simply enjoyable to be around. In their minds, my value as a person was limited to what I could provide materially. What did William see in me when we met? I asked quietly. I was 23 and he was 31. 8 years wasn't 30, but it was still a significant difference at that stage of life. Richard looked surprised. That was different. You were both young. I was a secretary with a high school education. He was a college graduate starting his own business. People could have questioned what he saw in me, or what I might have wanted from him. But you proved them wrong. Exactly. We proved them wrong by building a strong relationship based on mutual respect and shared values. Why is it impossible that Daniel and I might be doing the same thing? Richard was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the cognitive dissonance I had created. His own marriage had started with a similar age gap, though in the more traditional direction. He was being forced to confront his double standard. I suppose, he said finally, my real concern is that you might be vulnerable to someone who would take advantage of your grief and loneliness. That's a fair concern, I agreed. But Richard, I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago when William died. I've grown stronger, more confident, more clear about what I want from my remaining years. I'm not making this decision from desperation or loneliness. I'm making it from a position of choice and strength. And if we're wrong about him? If he really does care about you, then you'll have missed the opportunity to support me in something that brings me genuine happiness. And more importantly, you'll have damaged our relationship in a way that might be difficult to repair. The subtle warning was clear. Richard depended on me not just financially, though I had helped him with expenses since Eleanor's death, but emotionally. I was one of his few remaining connections to William and to the family relationships that had sustained him through difficult times. By the end of the week, I had accomplished two important things. First, I had demonstrated to each family member that their opposition could have costs as well as benefits. Second, I had gathered valuable information about their individual motivations and vulnerabilities. Carol was primarily concerned about her professional reputation and needed my financial support to maintain her business. Stephen was struggling with his own financial pressures and couldn't afford to alienate his primary source of family assistance. Richard was isolated and lonely, dependent on our relationship for emotional connection and practical support. None of them had asked about my happiness or well-being, except in the most superficial terms. None of them had expressed curiosity about Daniel as a person or interest in understanding what I saw in him. Their opposition was based entirely on their own fears, prejudices, and self-interest. Armed with this information, Daniel and I began implementing the next phase of our plan. Rather than confronting their objections directly, we would demonstrate, through our actions and community connections, that their assumptions were wrong. Daniel suggested we start by becoming more visible in positive community activities, showing people the reality of our relationship rather than letting them rely on speculation and gossip. The Historical Society was planning a fundraising gala for the fall, and I had been asked to chair the planning committee. Daniel offered to donate his landscape design services for the venue decoration, giving us a reason to work together publicly on something that benefited the community. Meanwhile, I scheduled individual meetings with Pastor Wilson and Dr. Moore, not to seek permission for my relationship, but to ensure they understood the full context of what I was facing. Both conversations proved more valuable than I had anticipated. Pastor Wilson, who had known me for over 20 years, was surprisingly direct in his support. "Maggie, I've watched you grow tremendously over the past 2 years. You've rediscovered your strength and your sense of purpose. If this relationship is part of that growth, then I can only see it as a blessing." Dr. Moore was even more emphatic. "What your family is doing is a form of emotional manipulation that's unfortunately common when elderly people assert their independence. They're using your love for them and your desire for family harmony to control your choices. The question is whether you're going to allow that to continue." Both conversations reinforced my growing conviction that I was fighting for something larger than just my relationship with Daniel. I was fighting for my right to self-determination, for the principle that age doesn't disqualify someone from making their own decisions about love and companionship. As the summer progressed, Daniel and I settled into a routine that balanced discretion with authenticity. We continued seeing each other regularly, but we were more careful about public displays of affection and more strategic about where we were seen together. At the same time, we made sure our professional collaboration on community projects was visible and respected. The strategy was working. People who interacted with us at committee meetings or community events could see that our relationship was based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect. The Historical Society board members, several of whom were prominent business leaders and community influencers, began commenting positively on our partnership. More importantly, I was building a network of allies who knew me as more than just William Thompson's widow. They saw me as Margaret Thompson, a capable woman with her own interests, talents, and aspirations. Their support would prove crucial in the confrontations I knew were coming. My family, meanwhile, seemed to believe their intervention had been successful. They saw my apparent compliance with their demands as confirmation that they had been right to intervene. Carol's relief was particularly evident. She had clearly been worried about the potential impact on her business reputation. But their satisfaction was premature. They had won a battle without realizing they were fighting a war, and they had underestimated both their opponent and the resources at her disposal. The time for subtle maneuvering was almost over. Soon, it would be time to reveal the full extent of what they were really up against. The turning point came in late July, when Carol made a crucial mistake. Emboldened by what she perceived as her victory in ending my relationship with Daniel, She began spreading her version of events around town. At a Chamber of Commerce networking event, she mentioned to several business associates that she had successfully intervened to protect her mother from an inappropriate relationship with a much younger man. The problem was that several people at that event knew Daniel professionally and respected him. They also knew me from my work with the Historical Society and found Carol's characterization of both of us offensive and inaccurate. Word of her comments reached me within 24 hours, delivered by Helen Martinez, who had heard it secondhand from the wife of a board member. "Maggie," Helen said when she called, "I think you need to know what Carol's been saying about you and Daniel. It's not pretty, and it's not fair." As Helen repeated the details of Carol's comments, I felt my carefully maintained patience finally reach its breaking point. My daughter had not been content with forcing me to end my relationship. She was now actively damaging my reputation. And Daniel's, spreading a narrative that painted me as a foolish old woman, and him as a predatory opportunist. The time for strategic patience was over. It was time to show my family exactly what they had started, and exactly what I was capable of finishing. The Monday morning after Helen's call, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and William's old address book, planning what would essentially be a declaration of war. For 2 months, I had played the role of the compliant widow, appearing to bow to my family's demands while quietly building my own foundation of support. Now, Carol's public humiliation campaign had forced my hand, and I was ready to show them exactly what they had unleashed. My first call was to James Bradford, the attorney who had handled William's estate and continued to manage my legal affairs. James had known our family for over 15 years, and I trusted his discretion completely. When I explained the situation, including Carol's recent public comments about Daniel and me, his response was swift and decisive. "Maggie, what they're doing borders on elder abuse," he said bluntly. "Attempting to control your personal relationships through financial intimidation and public humiliation is exactly the kind of behavior we see in families who view elderly relatives as resources to be managed, rather than people to be respected. I want to make it clear to them that I won't tolerate this behavior," I said. "But I want to do it in a way that gives them a chance to reconsider their position before things escalate further." James was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him thinking through the legal implications. "I can draft a letter that establishes your position clearly without being inflammatory. Something that makes it obvious you're serious about protecting your autonomy while leaving room for them to step back gracefully." "Perfect. And James, I want to make some changes to my financial arrangements. Nothing permanent, but I want to ensure that my current generosity to family members is clearly documented as gifts that could be discontinued at my discretion." "Understood. I'll prepare documentation that protects your interests while making it clear that family support is contingent on appropriate behavior." My second call was to Dr. Patricia Moore, who had been helping me navigate the emotional complexities of starting over after William's death. Patricia was not just a therapist. She was a recognized expert in family dynamics and elder care issues, with credentials that would carry weight if this situation escalated to involve outside authorities. "Margaret, I've been expecting this call," she said when I explained what had been happening. "Based on our sessions, I could see that your family was struggling to accept your growing independence. The fact that they've moved to public shaming suggests they're feeling desperate to regain control. I need documentation that I'm mentally competent and making these decisions from a position of strength, not vulnerability," I said. "If this gets ugly, they might try to question my judgment or suggest I'm not capable of making my own choices. I can provide a comprehensive evaluation that establishes your mental acuity, emotional stability, and decision-making capacity," Patricia assured me. "In fact, I'd recommend we do that regardless, because it sounds like you're dealing with family members who might escalate their interference." My third call was to Pastor Wilson, who had become not just a spiritual advisor, but a community leader, whose opinion carried significant weight in Cedar Falls. I explained Carol's public comments and asked for his guidance on how to handle the situation with grace while still protecting my dignity. "Margaret, I'm disappointed, but not surprised," he said. "I've seen this pattern before with families who can't accept that their elderly relatives remain full human beings with their own needs and desires. What Carol is doing is gossip disguised as concern, and it's harmful to everyone involved. I'm planning to address this directly, but I wanted you to know what was happening in case people start asking questions." "I appreciate that, and I want you to know that you have my full support. In fact, I think it might be appropriate for me to address the topic of respecting our elders' autonomy in this Sunday's sermon. Not specifically about your situation, of course, but about the broader principles involved." By noon, I had assembled what amounted to a professional support team: legal representation, medical documentation, and spiritual guidance from respected community figures. But more importantly, I had confirmed that my assessment of the situation was accurate. What my family was doing was not normal family concern. It was manipulative behavior that crossed clear ethical boundaries. My next step was to contact Daniel and let him know that our period of strategic patience was ending. When I called, he was at a job site, but he could hear the determination in my voice and agreed to come over that evening to discuss our next moves. "I take it the waiting game is over," he said when he arrived, noting the stack of legal documents and notes spread across my dining room table. "Carol has made it over," I replied, filling him in on her public comments and my day of phone calls. "She's not content with forcing us apart. She wants to publicly humiliate both of us to justify her interference." Daniel's jaw tightened as I repeated Helen's account of Carol's networking event comments. "So I'm a gold-digging predator and you're a confused old woman who can't see she's being manipulated." According to her version of events, yes. And she's apparently been sharing this story with anyone who will listen, positioning herself as the responsible daughter who saved her mother from making a terrible mistake. "What's our move?" I handed him a copy of the letter James Bradford had drafted. It was addressed to all 3 family members and written in the formal but courteous language that lawyers use when they want to be absolutely clear about consequences without making direct threats. Daniel read it carefully, his eyebrows rising, as he took in the careful phrasing that established my legal right to make my own decisions while documenting the family's inappropriate interference. The letter also included a subtle but unmistakable reference to the financial support I had been providing to various family members, framed as generosity that required mutual respect to continue. "This is brilliant," Daniel said when he finished reading. "It's diplomatic enough that they can't claim you're being vindictive, but clear enough that they'll understand exactly what's at stake." James also prepared documentation showing every loan, gift, and financial assistance I've provided to family members over the past 5 years. Carol's emergency funds, Stephen's business loans, Richard's help with medical bills. It totals more than they probably realize. Daniel whistled softly as he looked over the financial summary. "They've been taking your generosity for granted while treating you like you're incompetent to make your own decisions." "Exactly. And now they're going to learn that generosity requires gratitude, and respect isn't optional in this family." But the letter was only the opening move. My real strategy was to demonstrate publicly that their characterization of both Daniel and me was not just wrong but absurdly so. The Historical Society Gala was scheduled for the first weekend in August, just 2 weeks away, and I was going to use that event to show the entire community exactly who we really were. The gala was the social event of the year in Cedar Falls, drawing business leaders, political figures, and community influencers from across the region. As the event chair, I would be in a highly visible position, and Daniel's landscape design work would be on display for everyone to see. More importantly, we would be working together as professional equals, demonstrating the respect and compatibility that formed the foundation of our relationship. "I want to make an announcement at the gala," I told Daniel as we planned our approach. "Nothing dramatic, just a simple acknowledgement of our relationship and our engagement. Daniel nearly choked on his wine. Our engagement? I laughed at his expression. I'm proposing to you, Daniel Rodriguez. Will you marry me? The silence that followed was long enough that I began to worry I had misread our relationship or moved too fast. Then Daniel's face broke into the biggest smile I had ever seen from him. Margaret Thompson, are you asking me to marry you so you can prove a point to your family? I'm asking you to marry me because I love you, and I want to spend whatever time I have left with someone who sees me as a complete person rather than a problem to be managed. The fact that it will also prove a point to my family is just a bonus. Daniel reached across the table and took my hands. In that case, yes. Absolutely yes. But I have one condition. What's that? I get to propose back to you properly with a ring and everything. I may be the younger man in this relationship, but I still have some traditional romantic instincts. We spent the rest of the evening planning not just our engagement announcement, but our entire strategy for the gala. Daniel would arrive early to oversee the final landscape arrangements, demonstrating his professional expertise and creative vision. I would work with the caterers and event staff, showing my organizational skills and community connections. Throughout the evening, we would interact naturally and professionally, letting people see our dynamic for themselves. Most importantly, when I made the announcement during the program portion of the evening, it would be in front of an audience that had already observed us working together effectively and respectfully. The community would be able to judge for themselves whether I appeared to be a confused elderly woman being manipulated by a younger man, or a confident, capable person making a thoughtful decision about her future. The next morning, I hand-delivered James Bradford's letter to each family member. I didn't stay to discuss it or answer questions. I simply left it with them and informed them that I expected a response within a week. The letter spoke for itself, and I wanted them to have time to process its implications without the pressure of an immediate confrontation. Carol was the first to call, just 3 hours after I had dropped off her copy. Her voice was tight with anger when she reached me. At home. Mom, what is this supposed to mean? Are you threatening us? I'm not threatening anyone, Carol. I'm simply clarifying my position and my expectations. This letter makes it sound like you think we're trying to control you for financial gain. Aren't you? The silence that followed was telling. Carol had expected me to deny the implications of the letter or soften my position when confronted directly. Instead, I was forcing her to examine her own motivations honestly. That's ridiculous, she said finally. We're concerned about your welfare. Then you'll be happy to know that I've had a comprehensive psychological evaluation that confirms my mental competency and decision-making capacity. Dr. Moore found no evidence of confusion, vulnerability, or impaired judgment. You had a psych evaluation? Carol's voice rose an octave. Why would you do that? Because I wanted to address any questions about my mental state before they became an issue. The evaluation is on file with my attorney, along with documentation of all the financial assistance I've provided to family members over the years. Carol was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear her calculating the implications. Mom, I think we need to talk about this in person. All of us together. I agree. But this time, the conversation will be on my terms. I'll let you know when and where. Stephen's call came that afternoon, and his approach was entirely different from his sister's. Where Carol had been angry and defensive, Stephen was confused and conciliatory. Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Carol said you sent some kind of legal letter, and now she's talking about family meetings and psych evaluations. Did we do something wrong? Stephen's genuine bewilderment reminded me that he had been following Carol's lead rather than developing his own position. His concerns about my relationship with Daniel had been real, but they had been amplified and directed by his sister's more calculating approach. Stephen, let me ask you something. When you expressed concerns about Daniel, were you worried about my happiness Or were you worried about how my relationship might affect you? I was worried about you getting hurt, he said immediately. I know what it's like to have people take advantage of you when you're vulnerable. But Stephen, did you ever consider that I might not be vulnerable? That I might be making this choice from a position of strength rather than weakness? I guess I assumed that anyone our age would be vulnerable in that kind of situation. Our age? Stephen, I'm not that much older than you are. Would you consider yourself too old to fall in love if something happened to Linda? The question seemed to catch him off guard. That's different. I'm a man. And that makes you more capable of making romantic decisions at 42 than I am at 68. The pause that followed was long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. I never thought about it that way. I guess I've been thinking of you as fragile since Dad died. But you're not really, are you? No, Stephen, I'm not. I'm stronger now than I've been in years, and I'm making decisions based on what I want for my future, not on what other people think is appropriate. And this Daniel guy, he really cares about you? He does, and I care about him. That's what makes this a relationship, rather than a financial transaction. Richard's response was the most measured of the three. He called that evening, after he had clearly taken time to think through the letter and its implications. Maggie, I owe you an apology. I've been treating you like William's widow instead of like Margaret Thompson, and that wasn't fair to either of us. Thank you for saying that, Richard. It means a lot. I'm still concerned about the age difference, and I still worry about your being hurt. But I realize those are my issues, not yours. You have the right to make your own decisions, even if I don't understand them. Would you be willing to meet Daniel? Actually meet him, not just judge him based on assumptions? Richard was quiet for a moment. Yes, I think I would. If he's important to you, then I should get to know him. I'd like that. And Richard, I want you to know that nothing in our relationship needs to change because of this. You're family, and you'll always be family. I just need family to respect my autonomy. I understand. And Maggie, for what it's worth, I think William would be proud of how you've handled this. He always said you were stronger than people gave you credit for. By the end of the week, I had responses from all three family members, and the tone of those responses told me everything I needed to know about how the next phase would unfold. Richard was genuinely reconsidering his position and open to building a relationship with Daniel. Stephen was confused but willing to listen and learn. Carol was angry, defensive, and preparing for a fight. The battle lines were drawn, but they weren't where my family had expected them to be. Instead of facing a united front of concerned relatives confronting a confused elderly woman, they were dealing with a competent, well-supported individual who had already anticipated their moves and prepared effective responses. The Historical Society Gala was now just 1 week away, and I spent that week in a flurry of preparation that had nothing to do with the event logistics I had already mastered. Daniel and I met with James Bradford to finalize the legal documentation that would protect our interests. We had dinner with Pastor Wilson and his wife, giving them an opportunity to see our relationship up close. Most importantly, we spent hours talking through the challenges we would face as a married couple with a significant age difference, ensuring that we were entering this commitment with realistic expectations. The ring Daniel presented me with was perfect. A vintage emerald surrounded by small diamonds, elegant without being ostentatious. When he knelt in my garden among the roses William and I had planted, asking me formally to be his wife, I felt a completeness I hadn't experienced since my first husband's death. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, slipping the ring onto my finger. "Once we announce this publicly, there's no going back to the way things were." "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied, "including the fact that we're going to face this together, whatever comes." The morning of the gala dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the outdoor celebration we had planned. Daniel arrived at the venue before sunrise to supervise the final installation of his landscape design, while I worked with the caterers and volunteers to ensure every detail was perfect. By mid-morning, the transformation was complete. The community center grounds had been turned into an elegant garden party venue, with Daniel's carefully planned arrangements creating intimate conversation areas throughout the space. His work was stunning, demonstrating not just technical expertise, but genuine artistic vision. As the afternoon wore on and early guests began arriving, I found myself watching their reactions to the venue and to Daniel's obvious pride in his work. These were the business and community leaders whose opinions carried weight in Cedar Falls, and they were clearly impressed by what they saw. More importantly, they were observing Daniel and me working together throughout the day, seeing the easy communication and mutual respect that characterized our partnership. By the time the formal program began, we had already demonstrated to anyone paying attention that we were equals in this relationship, each contributing our own strengths to shared goals. The moment for our announcement arrived during the evening program, after the Historical Society's annual report and before the auction that would raise funds for our preservation projects. I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included most of the influential people in our community, as well as my 3 family members, who had arrived together and positioned themselves prominently in the front section. Before we begin tonight's auction, I have a personal announcement I'd like to share with all of you. Many of you have worked with Daniel Rodriguez on various community projects over the past few months, and you've seen the quality of his professional work and his commitment to our community. I paused, letting my eyes find Daniel in the crowd, before continuing. What you may not know is that Daniel and I have been developing a personal relationship alongside our professional collaboration, and I'm delighted to announce that we're engaged to be married. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Applause erupted throughout the venue, with people standing to congratulate us. I could see genuine happiness on the faces of community members who had watched me rebuild my life over the past 2 years. But I could also see the expressions on my family members' faces. Richard looked surprised but not displeased. Stephen appeared confused but was clapping along with everyone else. Carol looked like she had been struck by lightning, her face cycling through shock, anger, and something approaching panic. The evening continued with the auction and celebration, but the real victory was in the conversations that followed throughout the rest of the night. Person after person approached us to offer congratulations and share their observations about our compatibility and obvious affection for each other. These were not people who could be easily fooled or manipulated. They were successful, experienced individuals who recognized a genuine relationship when they saw one. By the time the evening ended, it was clear that Carol's narrative about the confused elderly woman and the predatory younger man had been thoroughly discredited by the evidence of their own eyes. The community had seen us work together as equals, had observed our natural interaction and mutual respect, and had drawn their own conclusions about the nature of our relationship. As Daniel and I cleaned up after the last guests had left, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond the successful event. We had proven ourselves publicly, demonstrated our competency and compatibility, and established our relationship as a legitimate partnership worthy of respect and support. The real test, however, would come in the family confrontation I knew was inevitable. Carol's expression during my announcement had made it clear that she was not prepared to accept defeat gracefully. The gloves were about to come off, and the next phase of this battle would determine whether our family relationships could survive the collision between my determination to live on my own terms and their need to control the narrative of my life. But as Daniel and I drove home together that night, my engagement ring catching the streetlight and our future spreading out before us like a promise, I felt ready for whatever challenge came next. I had reclaimed my agency, proven my competency, and found love again. Whatever my family chose to do in response, they would be facing a woman who knew her own worth and was prepared to fight for her right to determine her own destiny. The confrontation I had been anticipating came exactly 48 hours after the gala, delivered in the form of an emergency family meeting that Carol had orchestrated without consulting me. She called Sunday evening while Daniel and I were enjoying a quiet dinner on my back porch, still basking in the success of Saturday's event and the overwhelmingly positive community response to our engagement announcement. "Mom, we need to meet tomorrow morning." Carol's voice was crisp and businesslike, the tone she used when she was trying to control a situation that was spiraling beyond her management. 10 o'clock at Richard's house. This has gone far enough. "I'm sorry, but I already have plans tomorrow morning," I replied calmly, though my pulse quickened at the obvious ambush she was setting up. "If you'd like to schedule a family meeting, I'd be happy to find a time that works for everyone." "This isn't a request, Mom. We're meeting tomorrow, and you're going to be there. We need to discuss what happened at the gala and what you think you're doing with this engagement nonsense." The word nonsense hung in the air like a slap. After 2 days of genuine congratulations and warm wishes from friends and community members, Carol's dismissive attitude felt particularly jarring. "Carol, I don't respond well to ultimatums. If you want to have a conversation about my engagement, we can arrange that like civilized adults. But I won't be summoned to appear anywhere like a child called to the principal's office." "Fine," Carol snapped. "Tuesday at 10, at your house. But this meeting is happening, Mom, whether you cooperate or not." "Art?" She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone and feeling the familiar surge of anger that had been building throughout this entire ordeal. Daniel looked up from his plate, reading my expression with the ease that had developed between us over the months. "Let me guess. Family summit meeting to discuss your shocking behavior?" Tuesday morning. Carol's organizing the troops for one final assault on my judgment and decision-making capacity. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Are you ready for this?" "More than ready. They still think they're dealing with the same woman who used to defer to their opinions to keep peace in the family. They're about to discover exactly how much that woman has changed." Monday was spent in preparation that felt almost military in its precision. James Bradford came to the house in the morning to review the legal documentation we had assembled and to discuss strategies for handling what was likely to be an emotionally charged confrontation. His advice was straightforward: remain calm, stick to facts, and make it clear that my decisions were final and non-negotiable. "They're going to try to provoke you into an emotional response that they can use to question your judgment," he warned. "Don't give them that ammunition. You hold all the cards here, but only if you play them strategically." Dr. Patricia Moore arrived in the afternoon for what she termed a pre-confrontation session, designed to help me maintain emotional equilibrium during what was likely to be a difficult conversation. Her insights into family dynamics proved invaluable as we discussed the psychological tactics my family might employ. "They're going to try several approaches," she explained. "Guilt about betraying William's memory, fear about financial security, shame about what others think, and probably direct attacks on Daniel's character and motivations. The key is recognizing these as manipulation tactics rather than legitimate concerns." "What about their threats to protect me from myself?" Carol hinted that they might try to have my competency questioned. Patricia smiled grimly. "They can try, but they'd need medical evidence of cognitive impairment, which doesn't exist. My evaluation clearly establishes your mental acuity and decision-making capacity. Any competency challenge would fail embarrassingly." Monday evening, Daniel and I had dinner with Pastor Wilson and his wife, Martha, at their invitation. The conversation was ostensibly social, but I could tell Pastor Wilson wanted to offer support before what he correctly anticipated would be a difficult family confrontation. "Margaret, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding respecting elders' autonomy," he said as Martha served coffee and homemade pie. "I delivered that sermon yesterday, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. People are tired of seeing elderly family members treated like children." "That's encouraging. I know some families struggle with these transitions." Martha leaned forward, her expression earnest. Margaret, Jim, and I have been married for 37 years. And one thing we've learned is that love doesn't operate on a schedule. When you find someone who makes you happy and treats you well, age becomes irrelevant. The community saw that Saturday night, Pastor Wilson added. The way you and Daniel work together, the respect you show each other, the obvious compatibility. Anyone with eyes could see that this is a genuine partnership. As they walked us to the door, Pastor Wilson placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. If your family gives you trouble tomorrow, I want you to remember that you have an entire community supporting your right to make your own choices. Don't let them convince you that their opinion is the only one that matters. Tuesday morning dawned gray and humid, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon that seemed to mirror the confrontation brewing in my living room. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that projected both authority and respectability, and I arranged the legal documents James had prepared in neat stacks on the coffee table where they would be visible but not threatening. Daniel had offered to be present for the meeting, but we had decided together that this was a battle I needed to fight alone. His presence would only give them ammunition for their arguments about his influence over me. Instead, he would be working at a job site across town, available by phone if needed, but not physically involved in the confrontation. Richard arrived first, looking uncomfortable but determined. At 72, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his bearing still carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the family patriarch. He settled into William's old chair without asking permission, a subtle but significant claim to territory in my own home. Maggie, I want you to know that I'm not entirely comfortable with this approach, he said, accepting the coffee I offered, with a grateful nod. But Carol convinced me that we need to have a serious conversation about this situation. I appreciate your honesty, Richard, and I want you to know that regardless of what happens today, you'll always be family. Stephen arrived 10 minutes later, clearly having been coached by his sister on the approach they planned to take. He was carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone preparing for an unpleasant but necessary task. Morning. Mom, he said, kissing my cheek with the automatic affection that had survived our recent tensions. I hope we can work this out today. Carol was precisely on time, arriving at exactly 10 o'clock with the punctuality of someone who viewed lateness as a loss of control. She was dressed in her most formal business suit and carried a leather briefcase that suggested she had come prepared for legal battle. Good morning, Mother, she said, the formal address clearly intended to establish distance between us. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. We settled in the living room with an arrangement that felt like opposing armies claiming territory. Carol positioned herself directly across from me, with Stephen and Richard flanking her like reinforcements. I remained in my usual chair, surrounded by the photographs and mementos that established this as my domain. Margaret, Carol began, using my full name with the same formal distance she had employed in her greeting. We need to discuss this engagement announcement and what it means for our family. I'm happy to discuss my engagement, I replied calmly. Congratulations are traditional in these circumstances. This isn't a joke, Carol snapped, her professional composure slipping slightly. You made a public spectacle of yourself Saturday night, and now the entire town is talking about our family. Yes, they are talking. They're saying how happy they are for me and how impressed they are with Daniel's work on the gala. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Stephen leaned forward, opening his manila folder. Mom, we've done some research on age gap relationships, and the statistics are troubling. The failure rate is significantly higher than traditional marriages, and the financial risks for the older partner are substantial. He handed me a stack of printed articles with highlighted passages about gold diggers, failed relationships, and elder exploitation. The research was clearly intended to overwhelm me with evidence that my decision was statistically unsound. I glanced through the papers briefly before setting them aside. Stephen, did you research any positive examples of age gap relationships? Any statistics about successful partnerships between older women and younger men? Well, no, but the negative examples are what we need to be concerned about. So you researched selectively to find evidence that supported the conclusion you had already reached. That's not research, Stephen. That's confirmation bias. Richard cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Maggie, we're not trying to attack you. We're trying to protect you from making a mistake that could hurt you financially and emotionally. Richard, I appreciate that sentiment, but I need to ask you something directly. Have any of you spent time with Daniel? Have you made any effort to get to know him as a person, rather than judging him solely based on his age? The silence that followed was answer enough. Carol finally spoke, her voice tight with frustration. We don't need to know him personally to recognize the pattern. Young man targets wealthy older woman, gains her trust through romantic attention, and then gradually gains access to her resources. It's a classic scenario. Based on what evidence? What has Daniel done that suggests he's interested in my money? He's dating a woman 30 years older than him, Carol said, as if this were self-evident proof of criminal intent. What other explanation could there be? The question revealed the fundamental assumption that had been driving their opposition from the beginning. In their minds, I had no intrinsic value that could attract a younger person. My worth was purely financial, and any romantic interest must therefore be financially motivated. What if the explanation is that he finds me intelligent, interesting, and attractive? What if we share common interests and values? What if he simply enjoys my company? Be realistic, Mom, Stephen said, his tone gentle but condescending. You're a lovely person, but you're 68 years old. Men Daniel's age don't typically pursue romantic relationships with women our age unless there's an ulterior motive. The casual cruelty of his statement took my breath away. My own son was telling me that I was too old to be genuinely desirable, that any man who claimed to care for me must be lying for financial gain. Stephen, when your father married me, I was 23 and he was 31. Was he exploiting me? Was there something suspicious about his interest in a younger woman? That was different. You were both young adults. I was a secretary with a high school education. He was a college-educated professional starting his own business. The power dynamic was arguably similar to what you're claiming exists between Daniel and me. Carol intervened before Stephen could respond, clearly feeling the conversation was getting away from her control. This isn't about Dad. This is about you making decisions that could destroy your financial security and embarrass our family. Embarrass the family how? People are talking, Mom. They're saying you're having a midlife crisis, that you're making a fool of yourself chasing after a younger man. Some people are even suggesting that you might not be mentally competent to make these kinds of decisions. The threat was delivered with surgical precision. Carol was letting me know that she was prepared to attack my mental competency publicly if I didn't comply with their demands. I reached for the documents James Bradford had prepared and placed them on the coffee table where all three family members could see them clearly. Carol, since you've raised the question of my mental competency, I thought you might be interested in Dr. Patricia Moore's psychological evaluation. I handed her the official report, watching her face as she scanned the professional assessment that confirmed my cognitive function, emotional stability, and decision-making capacity. The document was comprehensive and unambiguous, prepared by a licensed professional whose credentials were impeccable. You had a psych evaluation? Richard asked, clearly surprised by this development. I had a comprehensive assessment to address any questions about my mental state. Dr. Moore found no evidence of cognitive impairment, emotional instability, or compromised judgment. In fact, her report specifically notes my increased confidence and improved emotional well-being over the past year. Carol's face was flushed as she finished reading the evaluation. This doesn't change anything. You can be mentally competent and still make terrible decisions. That's true. And you can be mentally competent and still try to control other people's lives through emotional manipulation and financial intimidation. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Stephen looked confused, Richard appeared uncomfortable, and Carol's face was growing redder by the minute. "I'm not intimidating anyone," Carol said. "I'm trying to protect you from financial exploitation." "Are you? Let me share some interesting financial information with you." I reached for the second set of documents James had prepared, the comprehensive summary of every loan, gift, and financial assistance I had provided to family members over the past 5 years. The numbers were substantial and clearly documented. "Carol, over the past 5 years, I've provided you with $48,000 in emergency funds and business assistance. Stephen, your total is $36,000 in business loans and personal help. Richard, I've helped you with $22,000 in medical bills and home maintenance." The silence that followed was deafening. None of them had realized the full extent of my financial generosity, or perhaps they had simply taken it for granted as their due. "This documentation is now on file with my attorney," I continued. "Every gift was freely given, but they were gifts, not entitlements. My continued generosity depends on maintaining positive family relationships based on mutual respect." Richard was the first to understand the implications. "Maggie, are you saying that our support of your relationship affects our financial relationship with you?" "I'm saying that people who question my competency while simultaneously depending on my financial support might want to reconsider their position. I'm also saying that family members who attempt to publicly embarrass me or damage my reputation will find that my generosity has limits." Carol's lawyer training kicked in, and she immediately recognized the legal and financial leverage I was wielding. "You're threatening to cut us off financially if we don't approve of your boyfriend." "I'm explaining that my financial support for family members has always been contingent on appropriate behavior and mutual respect. That hasn't changed. But perhaps I need to be more explicit about my expectations." Stephen looked genuinely bewildered by this turn in the conversation. "Mom, we never asked you for money. You offered to help us." "You're right, Stephen. I offered because I love you and want to support your success. But love and support flow both ways in healthy families. When family members try to control my personal life or question my judgment publicly, that relationship becomes less healthy." The room fell silent as each of them processed the new dynamic I had established. They had come here expecting to pressure me into ending my relationship with Daniel. Instead, they were discovering that their own financial security was tied to respecting my autonomy. Carol made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This man has gotten into your head and turned you against your own family. The Margaret Thompson I know would never threaten her children, financially." "You're right. The Margaret Thompson you knew would have tolerated your interference to keep peace in the family. But that woman died with William. The woman sitting here now believes in mutual respect, honest communication, and the right to make her own decisions without family interference. And if we can't accept that?" I looked at each of them carefully before answering. "Then you'll need to decide what's more important to you, controlling my life or maintaining a relationship with me, because you can't have both." Richard was the first to speak, his voice thoughtful and measured. "Maggie, I think I owe you an apology. We've been treating you like you're not capable of making your own decisions, and that was wrong." "Thank you, Richard. That means a great deal to me." Stephen nodded slowly. "I guess I've been thinking of you as fragile since Dad died. But you're not fragile, are you?" "No, Stephen. I'm stronger than I've been in years." All eyes turned to Carol, who was clearly struggling with the complete reversal of the power dynamic she had expected to control. Her face cycled through various emotions before settling on something resembling resignation. I still think you're making a mistake, she said finally. But I'm beginning to understand that it's your mistake to make. Yes, it is. And Carol, I hope you'll give Daniel a chance. Actually get to know him before judging him. I think you might be surprised. The meeting ended with tentative agreements to move forward more respectfully, though I could see that Carol was far from convinced. Richard and Stephen seemed genuinely ready to reconsider their positions, but Carol's capitulation felt strategic, rather than sincere. As they prepared to leave, Richard turned back to me with a request that surprised everyone. Maggie, would you and Daniel join me for dinner this weekend? I'd like to get to know him properly. I think he'd like that very much, Richard, thank you. After they left, I sat alone in my living room surrounded by the legal documents that had helped me establish my independence and the family photographs that reminded me what I was fighting to preserve. The confrontation had gone better than I had hoped, but I knew this was just the beginning of a longer process of redefining our family relationships. My phone rang, and Daniel's voice filled the room with warmth and concern. How did it go? Better than expected. I think we've established some new ground rules for family interactions. And Carol? Carol is going to be the holdout. But Richard wants to have dinner with us this weekend, and Stephen seems genuinely willing to reconsider his position. That's progress. How are you feeling? I looked around my living room, at the house where William and I had built our life. Together, where I was now building a new future with Daniel. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace with my choices. I feel free, Daniel. For the first time since William died, I feel completely free to live my life on my own terms. I love you, Margaret Thompson. I love you too. And Daniel? Yes? I think we're going to be just fine. The dinner with Richard that weekend marked the beginning of what would become a complete transformation in our family dynamics. Daniel and I arrived at Richard's modest ranch house on Saturday evening, carrying a bottle of wine and flowers from my garden. I could see Daniel's nervousness beneath his confident exterior, though he hid it well behind polite conversation about the weather and compliments on Richard's well-maintained lawn. Richard answered the door wearing his best slacks and a button-down shirt, clearly having made an effort for the occasion. At 72, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints complained about sudden movements. But his handshake with Daniel was firm, and his eyes were alert with curiosity, rather than hostility. Daniel, welcome to my home, Richard said with formal courtesy. I apologize for the circumstances that delayed this introduction. Thank you for having us, Mr. Thompson. I know this situation has been challenging for everyone. Please, call me Richard. And yes, it has been challenging, largely because we've been operating on assumptions rather than facts. The evening that followed was revelatory in ways I hadn't anticipated. Over Richard's carefully prepared pot roast and homemade rolls, conversation flowed naturally from current events to local history, to shared interests in woodworking and vintage cars. Richard had been an amateur carpenter for decades, and Daniel's landscape architecture background gave them common ground in design principles and craftsmanship. You know, Daniel, Richard said as we lingered over coffee and apple pie, I owe you an apology. I made judgments about you without taking the time to learn who you are as a person. I understand the concern, Richard. From the outside, I'm sure our relationship raises questions. The questions aren't the problem. The problem was assuming I knew the answers without bothering to investigate. Richard turned to me with an expression that mixed regret with newfound respect. Maggie, watching you two together tonight, I can see what you've been trying to tell us. This isn't about age or money. This is about two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. The observation was simple but profound, cutting through months of complicated arguments to reach the essential truth of our relationship. Daniel and I did enjoy each other's company, in the easy, natural way that had nothing to do with financial calculations or social expectations. Thank you for seeing that, I said, feeling tears prick at my eyes. It means everything to have your support. You have it, both of you. And I want you to know that Eleanor would have loved Daniel. She always said the most important thing in any relationship was whether two people made each other laugh. Richard's reference to his late wife brought a comfortable silence to the table, the kind that comes when people are processing emotional truths together. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand, and I saw Richard notice the gesture with approval rather than skepticism. As we prepared to leave that evening, Richard surprised us both with an unexpected request. "I'd like to walk you down the aisle. Maggie, if you'd have me. William always said I was the brother he never had, and I think he'd want family to be there for your wedding." The offer brought tears to both our eyes. Richard's acceptance represented more than personal approval. It symbolized the bridge between my past with William and my future with Daniel, showing that love could honor memory while embracing new possibilities. Stephen's transformation took longer, but proved equally genuine. The following week, he called to ask if Daniel might be interested in looking at his auto shop's landscaping, which had been neglected for years. What started as a professional consultation became a friendship built on mutual respect and shared interests in both craftsmanship and small business challenges. "You know what I realized, Mom?" Stephen said during a family barbecue the following month. "I was so focused on protecting you from being hurt that I never considered you might be protecting yourself by choosing someone who actually makes you happy. It took courage to reconsider your position, Stephen. I'm proud of you for that." Linda helped me see it differently. She pointed out that when she married me, her parents thought I was too young and irresponsible for her. But she saw something in me that they couldn't see, and she was right to trust her own judgment. Stephen's wife, Linda, had indeed become an unexpected ally, offering perspective from her own experience with family disapproval and age-related judgments. She and Daniel quickly developed an easy friendship, bonding over their shared status as the ones who had married into the Thompson family dynamics. Carol's journey toward acceptance proved more complex and gradual. Her initial strategic retreat at our confrontation had been tactical rather than genuine, and she spent several weeks testing the boundaries I had established while looking for ways to regain influence over the situation. The turning point came when her real estate business faced a serious crisis. A major development deal she had been counting on fell through, leaving her with significant financial obligations and a cash flow problem that threatened her professional survival. True to form, she turned to me for help, but this time she approached the conversation differently. "Mom, I need to ask you for a favor," she said when she came to see me on a Thursday evening in late September. "And I know I don't have any right to ask after how I've behaved about Daniel." "What kind of favor?" "Financial help. My business is in trouble, and I need a bridge loan to keep my office open while I rebuild my client base." The request wasn't unusual. I had helped Carol through business difficulties before. What was different was her acknowledgement that her behavior had earned her the right to expect my continued support. "How much do you need?" $15,000. I can pay it back over 18 months once things stabilize. I was quiet for a moment, considering not just the financial request but the opportunity it represented. "Carol, I'm willing to help you, but I want something in return." Her face tensed, clearly expecting me to demand an apology or public retraction of her previous statements. Instead, I surprised her with a different kind of request. "I want you to spend time with Daniel and me. Real time, not obligation visits. I want you to get to know him as a person rather than as a threat to your version of family stability." "Mom, I've been wrong about a lot of things. You don't need to bribe me to treat Daniel fairly." "I'm not bribing you, Carol. I'm asking you to give our relationship the same consideration you'd want me to give to someone important in your life." The arrangement we worked out was both practical and meaningful. I provided the financial assistance Carol needed, and she began joining Daniel and me for regular activities, dinner conversations, community events, even helping with wedding planning. Gradually, her professional skepticism gave way to genuine appreciation for Daniel's character and our compatibility. "You know what convinced me you were right about him?" Carol told me months later as we addressed wedding invitations together. "It wasn't anything dramatic. It was watching him remember how you like your coffee and seeing him automatically save you the funny stories from his day. He pays attention to you in the way Dad used to." The comparison to William was the ultimate acceptance from Carol, acknowledging that my relationship with Daniel honored rather than betrayed the love I had shared with my first husband. Wedding planning became a family affair that healed relationships while creating new traditions. Richard insisted on hosting the rehearsal dinner, displaying a pride in the occasion that touched both Daniel and me deeply. Stephen and Linda offered their home's backyard for the ceremony, with Stephen personally building an archway where we would exchange vows. Even Carol threw herself into the preparations, using her networking skills to coordinate vendors and her attention to detail to ensure every element was perfect. The wedding itself took place on a crisp October afternoon, with autumn leaves providing a natural backdrop that complemented Daniel's landscape design for the ceremony space. The guest list included family, close friends, and community members, who had supported us throughout our journey together. Pastor Wilson performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity, addressing the unique circumstances of our marriage without making them the focus of the celebration. His words about love transcending expectations and the courage required to embrace new chapters resonated with many of the guests, several of whom were navigating their own later life transitions. "Margaret and Daniel," Pastor Wilson said during his remarks, "you've shown us that love doesn't operate on society's timeline. You've demonstrated that the heart doesn't consult the calendar before recognizing its perfect match. Today we celebrate not just your union, but your courage in choosing love over convention." The reception that followed was filled with laughter, dancing, and speeches that reflected the journey we had all taken together. Richard's toast was particularly moving, speaking about the importance of family support during times of change and the wisdom of trusting loved ones to make their own decisions. "When William died," Richard said, raising his glass as the reception guests quieted to listen, "we all worried about Maggie's future. What we didn't realize was that we should have been excited about it instead. Today we celebrate not just a wedding, but a woman who refused to let other people's limitations become her own." Stephen's speech focused on the lessons he had learned about judgment and growth, acknowledging his initial mistakes while celebrating the man who had become both his stepfather and his friend. "Daniel, when you married Mom, you didn't just get a wife. You got a family that needed to learn how to see beyond their own assumptions. Thank you for being patient with us while we figured out what really mattered." Carol's remarks were brief, but heartfelt, focusing on the strength she had discovered in watching me rebuild my life according to my own vision rather than others' expectations. "Mom, you taught me something important through all of this. You showed me that real love isn't about finding someone who fits other people's idea of appropriate. It's about finding someone who sees you completely and chooses to stay." The evening concluded with dancing under string lights that Daniel had installed throughout Stephen's backyard, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt both festive and romantic. As I waltzed with my new husband while our family and friends celebrated around us, I felt a completeness that went beyond personal happiness to encompass the healing of relationships I had feared might be permanently damaged. The months that followed brought continued growth and deepening bonds within our reconstituted family structure. Richard became a regular fixture at our Sunday dinners, often bringing small woodworking projects he had made for our home. Stephen and Daniel developed a genuine friendship that included fishing trips and collaborative projects around both our properties. Carol and I rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than hierarchical obligation, becoming genuine friends as well as mother and daughter. The broader community response to our marriage proved overwhelmingly positive, with our relationship becoming a source of inspiration for other older adults who were considering new romantic possibilities. Several couples approached us at community events to share their own stories of later life love, creating an informal network of support for people navigating similar journeys. Dr. Patricia Moore asked if I would be willing to speak at conferences about advocating for elderly autonomy, and I found myself becoming an unexpected voice for the rights of older adults to make their own romantic and life decisions without family interference. The speaking engagements were initially intimidating, but they proved deeply fulfilling as I connected with other families struggling with similar dynamics. The key message I try to share, I would tell audiences of healthcare professionals and family counselors, is that aging doesn't diminish someone's right to choose their own path. Love, companionship, and personal growth don't have expiration dates. When families try to control these choices, they often damage the very relationships they claim to be protecting. Daniel's landscape architecture business flourished as well, partly due to the connections he made through our wedding and community involvement, but primarily because of his genuine talent and professional integrity. The success vindicated my faith in his character, while providing additional evidence to any remaining skeptics that our relationship was based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. Our first anniversary celebration was held at the same community center where we had first met, now transformed by Daniel's ongoing landscape improvements into a showcase for his artistic vision. The Historical Society hosted the party, with board members and volunteers joining family and friends, in commemorating not just our marriage, but the positive changes our partnership had brought to various community projects. When we look at Margaret and Daniel, one of the board members said during the celebration, we see proof that the best partnerships combine individual strengths to create something larger than either person could achieve alone. Their collaboration has enriched our entire community. The evening included a surprise presentation of a commissioned portrait showing Daniel and me working together in the community center gardens, a gift from the Historical Society that recognized our ongoing contributions to preserving and beautifying Cedar Falls public spaces. As we drove home from the anniversary celebration, Daniel and I reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in our personal lives, but in our understanding of what family relationships could become when built on respect, rather than control. "Do you ever regret the fight we had to go through to get here?" Daniel asked as we pulled into our driveway. "Never," I replied without hesitation. The fight was necessary because it established the terms for all our future relationships. Everyone had to learn that love and respect aren't automatic just because we're family. They have to be earned and maintained. Your family certainly learned that lesson. They learned something even more important. They learned that I'm still a complete person with my own needs, desires, and capabilities. For too long after William died, they saw me as a diminished version of who I used to be. Now they see me as who I actually am. The second year of our marriage brought new challenges and opportunities that tested and strengthened both our relationship and our family bonds. Daniel and I decided to travel, taking the European trip William and I had always planned but never managed to arrange. Carol coordinated our travel insurance and itinerary with the same attention to detail she brought to her real estate transactions, while Stephen and Richard took turns checking on our house and maintaining the gardens. The trips we took together became sources of stories and photographs that enriched our family gatherings, with each journey adding new dimensions to our shared experiences. More importantly, they demonstrated to everyone that our marriage was about building a future together, rather than simply providing companionship for my remaining years. "You know what I love about watching you two travel?" Linda observed during a post-vacation dinner where we shared photos and stories from our latest adventure. "You plan these trips like you expect to have decades together, not like you're rushing to fit everything in before time runs out." Her observation captured something essential about our approach to marriage and aging. Rather than viewing our time together as borrowed or limited, we planned and dreamed and built as if we had all the time in the world. The attitude proved self-fulfilling, creating energy and purpose that enhanced both our health and our happiness. As I write this, 3 years after that first family confrontation and 2 years after our wedding, I'm struck by how completely our family dynamics have transformed. What began as a crisis of control and expectations has evolved into relationships based on genuine affection and mutual respect. Richard has become the grandfather figure to Daniel that neither of us expected, sharing woodworking techniques and family stories that connect our past to our present. Stephen treats Daniel as the brother he never had, including him in family decisions and seeking his advice on everything from business strategies to parenting challenges. Carol and I have developed the adult friendship I always hoped we might have, built on appreciation for each other's strengths rather than obligation or guilt. The community recognition of our relationship has exceeded anything I could have imagined. We've been featured in the local newspaper as an example of successful aging and later life love. The university's gerontology department has asked us to participate in research about non-traditional relationships among older adults. Most meaningfully, we've become mentors to other couples navigating family disapproval and societal judgment about age gap relationships. The most important thing I learned, I often tell couples who seek our advice, is that you can't live your life according to other people's timelines or expectations. You have to be willing to fight for your right to determine your own happiness, even when that fight involves people you love. Daniel and I continue to surprise ourselves with new discoveries about each other and new goals we want to pursue together. We're currently planning to establish a scholarship fund for non-traditional students pursuing landscape design or historical preservation, combining our individual passions into a shared legacy project. The garden we tend together has become a metaphor for our relationship, carefully planned but naturally growing, requiring ongoing attention but producing unexpected beauty. Like the roses William and I planted that continue to bloom each year, love proves capable of surviving seasons, of difficulty to flourish again when properly nurtured. As I sit on our back porch this evening, watching Daniel work in the garden while the sun sets behind our neighborhood, I'm filled with gratitude for the courage it took to fight for this life we've built together. The woman who once accepted family ultimatums to keep peace would never have imagined the strength she possessed to demand better treatment and create better relationships. The phone rings, and Carol's voice fills the evening air with news about her latest real estate success and plans for Sunday dinner with her own family. Stephen calls to share updates about his business expansion and ask Daniel's advice about landscaping the new location. Richard stops by unannounced with a wooden jewelry box he's made for our anniversary, staying for coffee and conversation about community theater auditions he's considering. These are the moments that justify every difficult conversation, every boundary I had to establish, every relationship I had to risk in order to claim my right to choose my own future. This is the life I fought for, filled with love that recognizes no expiration date, respect that acknowledges my continued growth, and family relationships based on choice rather than obligation. Tomorrow, Daniel and I will begin planning our next adventure, whether it's a weekend trip to explore new gardens or a longer journey to visit historical sites we've read about together. We'll work on community projects that combine our skills and interests. We'll have dinner with family members who now see us as individuals worthy of respect rather than problems to be managed. The story that began with judgment and ultimatums has become a celebration of possibility and transformation. The woman they once considered too old for love has become a testament to the truth that the heart recognizes no age limits, and that the courage to demand better treatment from those we love sometimes requires us to risk losing them in order to save the relationships worth keeping. Tonight, as every night, I fall asleep grateful for the unexpected chapters that remain to be written in a life I once thought was finished. Love, it turns out, is indeed ageless, and the best stories often begin with someone brave enough to say that other people's limitations need not become their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.